Orders of the day.
Ballot item number 4, private member's notice of motion number 93. Mr. Hillier.
The member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Speaker, I move that in the opinion of the House, the standing orders of the Legislative Assembly be amended to provide for the establishment of a standing committee on Indigenous relations to investigate matters related to Indigenous affairs, address complaints, and provide recommendations on Indigenous policy, and that the membership of the committee include members from all recognized parties, including independent members, and that the chair of the committee shall not be a member of the governing party, and that the committee shall focus on specific issues of concern, including, but not limited to, Indigenous land claims, Indigenous treaties, provision of provincial services on reserves, Indigenous impact benefit agreements, development of resources on native lands, education and curriculum, and that all bills and regulations that affect Indigenous peoples be referred to this committee, and that the House is excluded from referring bills at second reading that do not relate to Indigenous policy to the committee, and that the committee shall be empowered to review and report to the House its observations, opinions, and recommendations on any issues related to Indigenous policy.
Mr. Hillier has moved private member's notice of motion number 93. Pursuant to Standing Order 101, the member has 12 minutes for his presentation.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, I ask this House to examine and consider my motion to create a standing committee on Indigenous relations and make it a permanent fixture of this Assembly. It is without a doubt the single greatest question facing our country is our relationship with our Indigenous peoples. It is a question that has far-reaching ramifications, not just for Indigenous people, but for each and every Canadian, regardless of race, creed, or colour, regardless of one's economic or social standing, regardless if you're on the left or the right of the political spectrum, or somewhere in between. It is a question that has been vexing to resolve and endless in its evolving makeup. It is a question that has led to great harm to our economy, diminished prosperity, increasing violence, and it is striking at our very understanding of the rule of law. It has shaken our constitutional foundations of peace, order, and good government. To answer this question to the satisfaction of all Canadians, whether they be Native or non-Native, will require honest, frank, and factual discussions. It will require the goodwill and good faith of good people. There are those that believe that this is a federal matter, but that would be misinformed and wrong. We, as a provincial government, have both the responsibility and the jurisdiction to build partnerships with our Indigenous communities. I want to thank and congratulate the Premier and the First Nations of Webuquet and Martin Falls for their announcements earlier this week on the Ring of Fire. It's been a long, long time coming. For 12 years, this project has sat idle and without agreement. We've lost investment, jobs, and have continued poverty. It also casts a long shadow and a chill over whether or not Ontario was a good place to invest in, whether it was a good place to create jobs, wealth, and prosperity. A standing committee on Indigenous relations can build on this progress. Progress to a better life, not only for our Indigenous peoples, but a better, more harmonious and prosperous life for everyone. Increasingly, and for far too long, this relationship between government and Native peoples has been poisoned with rhetoric and extremism, often by those attempting to hijack legitimate Native grievances to advance their own personal political agendas. Political agendas of extreme anti-capitalism and environmental zealots who are often funded by outside foreign interests. Those are not Native, those are not Canadian interests. But we have also seen these extremists who attempt to distort our history, conflate unrelated matters, and use language and words of derision and discord to create dissent. That is not how we resolve problems in Canada. Extremists who often intimidate, coerce, and use violence to oppress differing or dissenting opinions. These are not Native or Canadian values. These extreme views have also created divisions within our Native communities, as has been reported often and for many weeks. We've even seen this grand, distorted expectation that there must be unanimity for any Native community decision to be valid or justified. Unanimity is a rarity in any community, on any subject. Progress cannot ever be made if unanimity is the bar that must be achieved. Demanding unanimity on all decisions is an extreme, and only extremists call for it. Indigenous peoples have far, far more in common with Canadians than our few differences. Yet there are those who attempt to exploit these small differences and overlook our common goals, values, and aspirations. Extremism is not the Canadian way, it's not the Native way, and it's not the way forward, only backwards. Speaker, I could share some of the elements of this extreme language that we've heard in social media and whatnot, but I think people have seen it and understand it. I don't believe anybody in this House would align themselves with those comments. But we must act together to temper this growing rise of intemperate, coarse invective that has entered the lexicon and the public square. There will be no progress while ideas and discourse in these veins are given purchase in the debate. These extreme views by extreme organizations must be and can be mitigated by using this institution and its committees to engage and examine the challenges and the difficulties through a thoughtful lens and with sincere deliberations. However, for this committee to work and for it to work well, we must also first lay aside our own partisan tendencies and our own adversarial dispositions. This motion recognizes our partisan and adversarial natures and attempts to mitigate them using a model along the lines of the Public Accounts Committee, which is arguably the least partisan of all committees. It places deliberations and reports ahead of votes. The caucuses will also have to do their part as well. For the committee to be effective, they must choose their members wisely and select members who are not only knowledgeable of our history, but attentive to hearing the other side. This motion must be an expression of the members of the House. It however, cannot be realized without further actions by the government, where the motion can be amended and improved upon. Speaker, my question today for everybody in this House is, shall we raise the expectations of this House? Shall we raise the expectations of the public? Shall we move forward in an attempt to resolve this great question before us? Shall we endorse and create a standing committee on Indigenous relations as a demonstration of our genuine commitment to truth and reconciliation, or will we just leave it to others? Thank you.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Peterborough-Kawartha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the Parliamentary Assistant to Indigenous Affairs, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to rise today to speak on behalf of not only my ministry, but also to convey the words of the minister that I represent, the member from Kenora Rainy River, and speak in support of the member from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston's motion to establish a standing committee on Indigenous relations. Our government is committed to developing strong relationships with Indigenous communities, and we understand the value of involving First Nations and Métis people in the decisions that impact their communities. The mandate of Indigenous Affairs Ontario focuses on promoting Indigenous economic development opportunities, improving the quality of life for Indigenous people, and meeting Ontario's legal obligations in respect of Aboriginal and treaty rights and land-related claims. And this work is a priority for our government. We're committed to uphold our constitutional duty to consult with Aboriginal communities. We believe that when the consultation is done in a clear and transparent way, we create a more stable business environment, develop strong relationships, and create economic opportunities. The establishment of the Standing Committee and the issues of concern it is intended to address would complement the work that's already happening, not only in Indigenous Affairs Ontario, but across our entire government. And today I'd like to highlight just some of the few initiatives that are currently underway. Madam Speaker, our government understands the socioeconomic gaps that persist for Indigenous people in Ontario today, and we want a future where all communities in this province are able to achieve prosperity. And we're partnering with ministries on a wide range of policies and programs that will help improve economic development opportunities for Indigenous people. For example, the teams at Energy, Northern Development and Mines and Natural Resources and Forestry are moving forward on revenue sharing from mining, forestry and aggregates to help Indigenous communities share in the benefits of resource development. In fact, the first payment of mining and forestry revenues under the Resource Revenue Sharing Agreement was made just this past December. Earlier this week, Premier Ford announced support for an environmental study for a road that would link remote First Nation communities in the Ring of Fire. This area is currently accessible only by winter ice roads or by air. To help support growth in the mining and the construction and in other skilled trades, this road is being developed. The Minister of Infrastructure and the Minister of Energy, Northern Development and Mines are currently developing Ontario's 5-year strategy to improve and expand broadband, digital services and cellular access in unserved and underserved areas, including advancing broadband access for First Nations. Last October, Premier Ford announced a $30 million investment in the Matawa Broadband Project to provide modern telecommunication services to 5 Northern First Nation communities, all the while supporting job creation and opening up more economic opportunities. We're collaborating with the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development on engaging Indigenous organizations in apprenticeship modernization, integrating social assistance employment services into the Employment Ontario system, and transforming Ontario's employment services. Funding through the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs Economic Development Programs and Indigenous Economic Development Fund and the Indigenous Community Capital Grants Program is providing support for training, job creation, community infrastructure, and consultation capacity in communities. Madam Speaker, through these initiatives and many others, we're providing better opportunities for employment and community success. Together, we're making a meaningful difference in the lives of Indigenous people so they can share fully in the prosperity of this province, not only today, but tomorrow as well. We're also very focused, Madam Speaker, on improving the quality of life for Indigenous people across this province. This involves working collaboratively across multiple ministries in diverse areas including health, mental health, education, child and family services, and justice. For example, our $3.8 billion investment over the next 10 years in mental health and addiction strategies includes nearly $13 million annually towards culturally appropriate mental health and addiction services, supports, and programs for Indigenous families and their communities. Earlier this week, the Minister of Health announced a mental health and addictions plan, which will provide continued support for grassroots-driven solutions to meet the unique needs of Indigenous communities. And we're working closely with the Minister of Community, Children and Social Services and the Solicitor General to combat human trafficking. Together, we're developing a strategy to address this heinous crime and help keep Indigenous women and girls who are at particular risk safe. Indigenous women and children deserve to live in an environment that enables them to thrive. Tackling the systemic causes that put Indigenous women and girls at a disproportionate risk of violence remains a top priority for our government. As we pursue our plan to build safe and healthy communities, we'll continue to work with the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and urban Indigenous organizations to address this critical issue. We're also focused on protecting Indigenous youth from the issues of violence, racism, and suicide. And to address this, we've invested in preventative services on the ground in First Nation communities focused on life promotion skills. These include community-led, youth-focused initiatives that promote leadership, build pathways to wellness, and address service needs. We want to support youth and families on their healing journey and to connect youth to their land and their culture. Our government has made a firm commitment to providing children in care with culturally appropriate supports, and this past summer, we announced the designation of Nagdawenmog Benujiog as Indigenous Children's Aid Society. It's the 12th Indigenous society to be designated. Together, we'll work to improve outcomes and opportunities for Indigenous children and youth. We're coordinating efforts with other ministries to improve the quality of life for people living in First Nation reserves. For instance, we continue to work closely with the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks to influence federal policies and operational approaches related to drinking water on reserves. And at Energy Northern Development and Mines, we're supporting the development of the Watay Power Project. Once completed in 2023, it'll be the largest Indigenous-led infrastructure project in Canada and most far-reaching First Nations grid connection effort in Ontario's history. The project will connect 16 remote First Nation communities to the provincial electric grid and provide over 14,000 First Nations people in northwestern Ontario with a clean, reliable and affordable supply of electricity. Madam Speaker, I'd like to also briefly mention our important work around land claims and treaties. Our government strongly believes that resolving Indigenous land claims and land-related matters through negotiations allows the province to meet its legal obligations and make a meaningful difference in the lives of all Ontarians. In 2018, working in partnership with the federal government, our government settled a long-standing dispute related to the 1923 Williams Treaties, and together issued a joint apology for the negative impacts these treaties had made on the Williams Treaties First Nations. As of January 2020, there were 74 active land claims in Ontario, 10 in research and assessment, 53 in negotiation, and 11 in implementation. Currently, Ontario is working with 90 Indigenous communities to resolve land claims and land-related matters. Successful negotiations bring economic benefits for Indigenous and neighbouring communities, creating opportunities and potential new business partnerships. We're working to resolve historic grievances through fair, respectful and meaningful agreements that advance the social and economic sustainability of Indigenous communities.
Order, please.
Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes that treaty relationships are just as relevant today as they were when those treaties were first signed. Last November, Ontario marked the 4th annual Treaties Recognition Week by supporting opportunities for people to learn more about treaties and their place in the province's history and heritage. Our government worked with Indigenous and education partners to deliver more than 200 treaty awareness events in schools, universities, and public libraries. Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers delivered teachings and provided their personal perspective to help deepen understandings of treaties. Making treaty relationships real and meaningful is important for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. Promoting awareness and understanding of treaties helps to advance us along the road of reconciliation and ensures everyone can participate in Ontario's prosperity. Despite all that we're doing, we know there's still more to be done. Our government will continue working together with all of our partners, inside and outside of government, to improve the economic and social well-being of Indigenous people. We know that by effectively working together, we'll meet these needs, and we welcome every opportunity to continue to collaborate on this vital work. Madam Speaker, in closing, I'd like to reiterate our government's support for the MPP from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston's motion to establish a standing committee on Indigenous relationships. Miigwech, Marci, Niawan. Thank you.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Kiiwetinoong.
Madam Speaker, it was here last week when I learned about the motion from the member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston to create a standing committee on Indigenous relations in Ontario. The member tabled this motion with the intention of creating that committee, to investigate matters related to Indigenous affairs, to address complaints, and also to provide recommendations on Indigenous policy. For me, I see the timing of this motion as interesting. If a member had a genuine interest in helping to resolve Indigenous issues, then I could support this motion. One of the things I'm hearing too is, our First Nations, our Indigenous people. I like to say that you do not own us. You do not own Indigenous people. The member had one of the things I want to mention is that the member has made some comments about Indigenous communities in the past that make me doubt his understanding of Indigenous issues. It always makes me think about when non-Indigenous people have this opinion that the Indian Act should be abolished. Indigenous issues will be solved by Indigenous people. Solutions to Indigenous issues should always be Indigenous-led. But we thank the member for his concern. In February of this year, the member called for that end to the Indian Act. The Indian Act is at its foundation flawed and colonial, but often calls for its end are motivated by the erasure of First Nations as distinct peoples. But more significantly, as a way for the Crown to end its treaty responsibilities, as well to open up reserve and traditional territories for heavy commercial and real estate development. For this committee to be effective, it must work to resolve Indigenous and Crown interests. I'm concerned that no Indigenous consultation was done in consideration for this motion. This has become a common theme in this place. This week, Chief Leo Matadawabin of Fort Albany stated that we will not consent to anything done with disregard for our inherent and treaty rights in response to the announcement made by the Ring of Fire development that affects Fort Albany's treaty territory. Also, in the same announcement, Chief Monias of Niskandaga First Nation said that you can expect opposition in Ontario if Ontario tries to put a shovel in the ground of our territory without our consent. Historically, consultation for development has always been done poorly in our communities. This is the same principle that has been applied in the creation of this motion. The days when proponents would come to in our territories, treaty territories, and do whatever they want with a partnership is over. Changes in governance and policy will not happen without free, prior, and informed consent. Real solutions and change must be led and developed by First Nation communities. Will this committee really examine the complex issues, or would it be just another bureaucratic hurdle for our communities to jump over in order to get anything done? This leads me to believe and also to have concerns that the scope of this committee is limited, lacked any engagement with Indigenous members of this Parliament. Example, Ontario does not treat First Nations people, Indigenous people as partners. They treat us as stakeholders. But I can support this motion. But again, I have serious reservations about the mandate and the real purpose of this committee, given the motion's sponsor. Miigwech.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Toronto Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today to speak to this motion. As one of the 3 Indigenous members of this legislature, and as far as I know, the first Indigenous woman ever elected to this House, I certainly support the notion of raising the profile of Indigenous issues within this legislature. The proposed idea of creating an Indigenous Relations Committee for this Assembly is certainly an interesting one, but I'd be remiss if I didn't raise some significant concerns that I have. My primary concern is the complete lack of consultation in relation to this motion. Not only did the member from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston not consult with any of the 3 Indigenous members of this House, I'm not entirely sure he consulted with anyone. Speaker, the specific point I'd like to make here is that there is no homogeneous Indigenous experience, and the process of reconciliation must recognize the diverse and unique experiences of Indigenous people and communities. My colleague, the member from Kiiwetinoong, brings a unique perspective to this House from a northern and remote First Nations voice. My colleague, the member from Mishkigowuk James Bay, brings another important perspective as a Métis man, also from a northern riding. And I stand here as a woman with mixed Indigenous heritage, raised in downtown Toronto in an entirely urban setting. And the urban Indigenous community is a home that many of us turn to when histories of adoption and foster care in our families have tried to make us the success stories of assimilation. Places like friendship centres give us the space and resources to reclaim our identities, languages, and cultures, and to piece together our bundles. It's a place for people who are coming home to their identities, maybe for the first time, in whatever way and whatever timeline that looks like, after generations of foster care, adoption, and residential schools. Any Indigenous committee process in this House needs to reflect the diversity of our communities, and I do not see that represented here today. The member from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston can't just declare as himself, all by himself, as a white legislator, that he knows better than any of our communities how to do the work of decolonizing the literal seat of colonial power for the province of Ontario. Which brings me, Speaker, to the member's track record on Indigenous issues, and I have to call into question the intent of bringing forward this motion at a moment in history when all eyes are on Wet'suwet'en and the national conversation we are having about reconciliation. On his own website, the member published a post on February 17, 2020, on the subject of land defenders in Tyendinaga, standing in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en. And he's repeated many of those remarks here today in this debate, and I quote, "Small groups of radical, privileged, and dishonest ideologues are attempting to derail Canadian society. These groups have hijacked our charitable dispositions, successfully stifled our freedom of speech through coercive political correctness, distorted our education, rewritten our history, abused freedom of assembly, caused financial harm and grave disruption to our economy, while seeking to impoverish and lower the standards of all Canadians regardless of their ancestry." And if I didn't know any better, Speaker, I would suggest he was speaking of the colonial history of Canada, not of Indigenous people in Ontario. And I think what he makes perfectly clear in these statements is that the member sees himself as having some sort of self-appointed purpose to single-handedly save our communities with the gospel of capitalism and the gospel of forced pipelines, and that he has no basic working knowledge of the violent and genocidal history of this country. Speaker, I cannot think of a worse foundation on which to have this committee brought into existence in this House. Miigwech.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Don Valley West.
Thank you very much.
Madam Speaker. I was listening to the member for Lanark Frontenac Kingston. I was working in my office and I was listening to his remarks, and I had of course read the motion for today, and on paper the motion looks quite respectable. It looks like something that we could support. It looks like something that might have great utility. But, Madam Speaker, as I listened to the member from Lanark Frontenac Kingston, I realized that the intention behind this committee is not at all consistent with what the words on the page say. And so I will follow the lead of the Indigenous members of this House, Madam Speaker, and if they feel that it is appropriate for this House to support this motion, then I will certainly stand in solidarity with them. But I would just make this word of caution, that there have been many words written on pages over history that have not been used in the way that the people reading them expected them to be used, that the intention behind those words, whether it's treaties, whether it's memorandum of understanding, whether it's contracts, they have been used as weapons against the very people that they purport to protect or whose interests they purport to advance. I spent much of my career, Madam Speaker, as a minister and then as Premier, meeting with Indigenous people, working to find ways to invest in, to support, whether it was apologies in the legislature or whether it was investments in education or whether, Madam Speaker, it was exploring the possibility of economic development through the Ring of Fire, which the current government has now exploited using the work that we did over a number of years. Madam Speaker, I am completely supportive of a mechanism that would do what the words on the page say. But I would just put the member from Lanark Frontenac Kingston on notice that if this committee begins to be used as a hammer, if this committee is perverted to advance exactly the colonial agenda that I think we heard expressed by the member, then I think we all need to rise up and say, that's not the purpose of the committee, that's not what it should be used for, and we should strike it down, Madam Speaker.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Guelph.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Pleased to rise to speak on this motion, and like my colleague, I too will take the lead from the Indigenous members of this House in how I vote on this motion. I believe that any committee that is designed in this legislature to deal with Indigenous relations should be done through the lens of decolonization and reconciliation. And any intent behind this motion and this committee should be done as an action where we engage in nation-to-nation conversations that are all about decolonization and reconciliation. And so I want to appreciate the members who have spoken on this motion. And if the House does decide to move forward with a permanent standing committee, I strongly urge my colleagues to do it within the spirit of ending the colonial relationship we've had historically and actually settling issues in a way that respects free and informed prior consent, respects nation-to-nation discussions. And as my colleague said, Indigenous peoples are not stakeholders. We have Indigenous nations in this country, not stakeholders. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Mushkegowuk, James Bay.
Madame la Présidente. I rise today to speak about motion 93. I have mixed feelings about the member from Leonard Frontenac Kingston's motion. On the one hand, the motion gives voice to Indigenous affairs and follows the attempt done in other Canadian legislature. Encore, je crois que cette motion donnera une...
I think this will give a voice to Indigenous people in this assembly. We could create links for the Indigenous people of Ontario.
My dissatisfaction with this issue and comments related to the motion are on record. First, the member from Lanark Frontenac Kingston failed to consult with Indigenous members of the legislature. Neither a critic of Indigenous affairs and reconciliation nor any of the Indigenous members of the opposition caucus were made aware of this motion ahead of time. Second, none of the chiefs, Grand Chiefs, or members of First Nation in Ontario to whom I spoke were aware of the member's intention. Troisièmement, je suis préoccupé par le rapport.
It was concerned, there's other worries in terms of the member from Lanark Frontenac Kingston, his statements on 24th of February. In his 2 articles, he denies historic facts regarding the Indigenous people. On the 7th of February, the member says,
the vast majority of my fellow Canadians have oppressed the Indigenous people of Canada. Speaker, to make this assertion is to deny the structural oppression of First Nation, Métis, Inuit in this province and in Canada. Has the member forgotten the 120 years of residential school system? In all our relation, Tanya Talega quotes Duncan Campbell Scott, the infamous superintendent of Indigenous Affairs. In 1920, Scott famously said in a parliamentary committee, the objective of the residential school is to continue until there is no single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politics. The residential school system by Duncan Campbell Scott engineered took 150,000 First Nation, Métis, Inuit children away from their parents, families, communities, culture, and language. Roughly 6,000 of those children died of residential schools, let alone the thousands of children who left the system with scars that extend all the way to the present. Indigenous people continues to live with these scars. I work hard with the communities in my riding to ensure we work together for these challenges. Speaker, let me conclude by saying I do endorse the motion. My dissatisfaction arises from the members' inaccurate comments when it comes to this relation. But I do believe that this motion may enable a forum that focuses on the challenge faced by Indigenous people and how they could be better served by the province. Merci, Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Miigwech.
The member for Lanark Frontenac Kingston has 2 minutes to reply.
Thank you, Speaker, and thanks to all the members who spoke. As I mentioned in my remarks, I believe that this committee is a necessary forum for people to help people resolve differences. And I specifically mentioned in my remarks that we would have to put aside our adversarial dispositions, that we would have to put aside our partisan natures, and that we would have to be attentive and listening as members with that form. So I guess I'm sorry that there are so many people think the message is good, but the messenger is poor. For that, but the sentiments are genuine, that we have a forum to help resolve differences, okay, and move forward and improve our province, improve our country, improve our relationships, and those difficulties, those sometimes intractable difficulties, that we actually have and as I said in my statements, a committee made up with goodwill, good faith, and good people Who would be on that committee? That would be up to others to decide. It's not my decision. That would be up to the House leaders and the leaders of the parties to select who would be on that committee. And I would think that at least 3 members, Indigenous members of this House, would probably be on that committee. But that would be a decision by the NDP. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Hillier has moved private member's notice of motion number 93. Is it the pleasure of the House that the motion carry? I declare the motion carried.